On the morning of June 28, 1914, the streets of Sarajevo were crowded. The city sat at a volatile intersection of imperial power and local nationalist fervor, and hidden along the motorcade route were several armed conspirators. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, survived the first attack. A bomb thrown at his car detonated in the street, injuring bystanders but leaving him unharmed. The visit could have ended there. But later that day, a wrong turn by the Archduke's driver brought the vehicle to a halt directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, one of the assassins who believed the plot had failed. At a range of only a few feet, Princip fired 2 shots. One bullet struck the Archduke, the other struck his wife, Sophie. Within minutes, both were dead. The assassination was a localized tragedy, but its timing was catastrophic. It occurred in a region where ethnic tensions and imperial rivalries had reached a breaking point. To much of the world, pre-war Europe appeared invincible. Its major capitals were centers of immense industrial wealth and global political influence, projecting an image of permanent stability and progress. But beneath the surface, the continent was fracturing. Nationalist movements were gaining strength, and every single major power was engaged in a quiet, relentless competition for military dominance. European leaders attempted to manage this instability through a complex system of alliances. They firmly believed that by creating these mutual defense pacts, they could discourage aggression and maintain a balance of power. This strategy divided the continent into 2 armed camps. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed one bloc. Britain, France, and Russia formed another. The system was designed for stability, but created a dangerous dependency. A conflict involving one nation would pull the entire network into war. The network of treaties had transformed localized friction into a systemic risk. By the summer of 1914, the heavy hardware of war was fully installed. It only required a signal to activate. In the weeks following the assassination, Austria-Hungary issued a series of harsh demands to Serbia. When Serbia rejected several of these terms, Austria-Hungary declared war. The reaction was immediate. Russia mobilized to support Serbia, triggering Germany's alliance with Austria. Within days, France and Britain were pulled into the escalating confrontation. Across Europe, the declaration of war was met with public celebrations. Enormous crowds gathered in squares, supporting their nations with a confidence that would soon be shattered. Millions of young men volunteered to fight, viewing the conflict as a brief and patriotic adventure. Very few understood that they were marching toward a new kind of industrialized slaughter. Once the mobilization orders were signed, the war developed a momentum of its own. Military deployments relied on rigid railway timetables that operated with mathematical precision, leaving no room for late-stage diplomacy. Political leaders found themselves unable to pause the machinery they had set in motion. They feared that any delay in mobilization would leave their borders defenseless, forcing them to proceed purely out of a strategic need for survival. The crisis became a cascading system failure. The leaders who had built these machines for defense eventually lost the ability to control them. The optimism of 1914 was quickly replaced by the reality of modern combat. The war did not end in months. It settled into a brutal contest of endurance. Technology had transformed the battlefield into an automated slaughterhouse. Heavy artillery, machine guns, and mechanized weapons allowed armies to inflict casualties on a scale that had never been possible before. The armies ground to a halt in vast trench systems that stretched across Europe. Millions of soldiers lived and died in these muddy, disease-ridden lines, fighting for small gains that were often lost the following day. The use of poison gas added a new layer of psychological terror to the conflict, stripping away remaining notions of military honor or romanticized warfare. By the midpoint of the conflict, the 19th century concept of glory had been replaced by the grim reality of industrial attrition. When the fighting ended in 1918, the scale of the destruction was evident in every corner of the continent. Entire towns had been erased, and landscapes were permanently scarred. Beyond the physical damage, the war had decimated a generation of young men and bankrupted the world's most powerful economies. The political map of the world was redrawn. 4 major global powers, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, collapsed under the strain of the war. In Russia, the exhaustion of the war triggered a total internal collapse. The empire fell into revolution and civil war, leading to a political transformation that would define much of the next century. The conflict also left deep psychological scars. There was a widespread loss of faith in the political systems and the ideas of progress that had dominated European life before 1914. The 2 shots fired in Sarajevo did more than spark a war. They dismantled the global political structure that had been built over centuries. The events of 1914 illustrate how quickly the momentum of a crisis can outpace the ability of leaders to stop it. When the mechanisms of war were activated, the combined weight of national pride and binding treaties overrode any remaining path toward peace. Civilizations rarely collapse because of a single sudden event. Instead, they unravel one decision at a time until the momentum becomes unstoppable. The armistice of 1918 did not resolve the underlying tensions of the continent. The peace treaties that followed failed to address the systemic anger and instability created by the fighting. The resulting environment was characterized by economic ruin and political radicalization. The end of the war left behind a deeply damaged society that was already preparing for its next crisis. The conflict that began in Sarajevo never truly ended. It simply paused, creating the exact conditions needed for the rise of radical extremism and the emergence of Adolf Hitler.